Welcome back, Richard. It's good to see you on this day where we're going to talk about a tough topic.
Yeah. These are touchy places to venture into.
Yes.
Feel like I'm climbing on a very thin sheet of ice here, just crawling out, listening to that ice crack underfoot, wondering when we're going to fall in. But we will do so carefully.
Yeah. We'll do our best, but this is a sort of an extension of what we talked about last week, where we were talking about, parents' tendencies to sort of overparent during this time when, we're trying to get back to life, after COVID. But it's like life after COVID, but it's like we're trying to do life before COVID. And it's a very odd dynamic that we're trying to thread here. But we are going to kind of extend that conversation and talk about other ways that many parents are attempting to exert control and to manage. And I think if we're thinking about it kindly, parents are trying to protect or see what they think of as protecting their kids, but some of the ramifications and consequences of that as well, and especially as it relates to this really significant upsurge in book banning.
Right. Yeah. Last week we talked. In fact, the title of our talk last week was "Proceed with Caution," and we were talking to parents. We were advising parents to be careful about this urge to regain control, because during the pandemic, everybody lost control of everything. Okay, and so and one of the things that parents of school-age children noticed is that prior to the pandemic, there was a certain rhythm about school. Kids were motivated, they had some momentum, they were just about ready to begin the last 9 weeks of the school year. And in March of 2020, everything fell apart, okay? And parents noticed that upon returning to school 6 months later, a year later, whenever it was, that kids sort of were out of practice. They had sort of forgotten how to go to school, and they weren't approaching assignments very seriously. They weren't behaving in class the way they did before the pandemic. And parents had this sense that things had gotten out of control, and my child wasn't doing assignments, and there were a lot of zeros showing up, and they were getting some low grades. And so parents started to panic a little bit and say, wait a minute, I gotta regain control of this. And so they started practicing what we called intensive parenting, where they said, I got to get this under control again. Okay. And so as the acute challenges, we often forget that there was a time when we were afraid to die from this disease. I mean, that's a few years ago.
Right.
This was a life and death issue. It wasn't about homework. It wasn't about getting a zero on an assignment or having a late assignment. We were actually concerned about whether we would die if we got this disease. Remember, teachers were concerned if kids bring it into the classroom. What are my risks? We had to stay 6 feet apart. And we were beginning to forget those acute challenges that we faced in those years.
Right.
And so when kids after and we forget about all the interruptions. My child's class is quarantined, so they have to miss a week of school. They have to go back home and stay at home for a week. So we forget all of those things, and so we forget all the acute challenges. And now parents are beginning to worry about, well, why is my child not doing as well in school? Why are they not taking school seriously anymore?
Right. Well, I think that I think something to throw in here that is just a really important point, because I think some criticism when we think about the effects that COVID has had on everything. I think that we're starting to get into that time frame now where people are being critical of that explanation, and they're saying, well, that was 2 years ago, that was a year and a half ago, that was a year ago, and it's true. The interruptions from COVID have been far less this past school year.
Right.
But the problem is that everyone is working to catch up. And so whereas, we did have that time off and students are working to kind of get back into what the rhythm of school was like and everything.
Right.
Schools have been, and I'm going to use a word that is going to have a lot of different connotations to it, but schools have been very forgiving when it comes to these issues that students have presented with. And as a result, students have grown accustomed to a lot of forgiveness. They've grown accustomed to, well, we're going to forgive these grades. We're going to make sure that they don't, fail because they're not getting their homework done. We're going to make sure that they have opportunities for grade recovery and things like that. And while on one hand, that's great because it was like, okay, the schools are really recognizing how significant of an influence COVID had on these students, and we're trying to get them back into the rhythm. What it's also done is it's reinforced to students that it's okay. There's going to be a safety net, and you're going to be able to make it anyways. And some students, at least a good percentage of students, have really grabbed a hold of that, and they're really using that as their life preserver, to the point where they're not able to get back into that rhythm that we need them in.
That's right. A significant number of students, even students who were doing well prior to the pandemic, are not doing so well now because of this grace. In a sense, they've been offered this grace. Remember, in March of 2020, there was no testing.
Right.
End of year testing. Okay. Just didn't exist. And students were told nobody would be held back. And it didn't matter what your grades were. It didn't matter at what grade level you were reading. Everybody was going to be promoted. And then you had summer vacation. And then you had another year of interruptions. The 2020 and 2021 school year was another year of disruption and interruption. And so students sort of got out of the habits, the good habits that they had developed over the years. All those began to evaporate. And so there's this very real feeling that kids seem to have forgotten how to go to school, okay? And as a result, parents began to monitor those parent portals. They're able to have access, and they're able to have access on a daily basis, on an hourly basis. They can monitor, they can keep that tab open all day long. They're searching for late assignments, for missing assignments, for low test scores, and they're ready to jump in and to provide the motivation and the momentum that their children have lost, that their school-age children have lost. So, and it's understandable that parents want to fill in so that their kids don't get farther behind. They know their kids lost some time in the past few years, and so now they want to provide the momentum and the motivation that their kids seem to be lacking. And the point we made last week was that for children younger than 12, parents can have that kind of influence. Right. I mean, even though it's not a good idea, because by grade 3, by the end of the 3rd grade, children should be able to monitor this themselves. Right. They should be keeping track of their belongings. They should be keeping track of assignments. They should know when things are due. They should know when the spelling test is. And they should be able to manage all that on their own. Well, if parents assume that responsibility, then they're denying the kids the opportunity to learn how to accept their responsibility. But it's a very different challenge for kids who are 13 and older. Right. Because now you really want to turn things over to the kids. Right. And we use the term detachment parenting, that this is a time when parents need to step back and let the teenager assume more and more responsibility. So when after age 13, all this increased parental monitoring and tracking and oversight is coming at exactly the wrong time. And that was our podcast last week. And so in the 12 to 13, after 12 or 13, you shift to detachment parenting, because no matter what we do, no matter what parents do at that point, their teenagers are going to begin to separate. Right. Okay. We talk about it over and over again. And unless you can somehow keep your children totally dependent on you, either we don't advise that you do that. I don't think it's a good idea. I mean, there are ways that parents keep their children totally dependent, but in almost all cases, they're going to do everything they can to separate and become their own person. Right. And that's why we advise parents, begin to prepare your children for that and begin to prepare them that they can assume full responsibility for all of their school obligations. Okay?
Right.
So when we saw this article by Jessica Gross, it interested us because what the title of it was is book banning is all about the illusion of parental control. And the reason this was interesting to us was because our county had just gone through an evaluation of books that were recommended to be banned from public school libraries. And her point is book banning is about the illusion of parental control, especially with teenagers. So we thought, well, this is interesting. Mm-hmm. You and I had just talked about the parental control with teenagers, or the attempt to control teenagers. And we had just been through a book banning, and here we have these two things put together.
Right. Yeah. And it's we were fortunate to here in our district, because school district, because the 16 books were recommended for removal from the district library, school district libraries. And what we did was a committee was put together. Actually, two committees were put together. Yeah. And the committees were comprised of people from varied backgrounds. Right. And you and I had the opportunity to sit on those committees. You were on one committee and I was on the other committee, and each of us reviewed 8 of the 16 books. And it was a fascinating process to hear people's opinions, thoughts, and reviews of some of these books, some of them which were, Pulitzer Prize winning books that have been around for a long time, that have really helped shape the way that we think about some things. Mm-hmm. And it was an interesting process to review. And again, this article, she talks about this issue and the ramifications and the potential, the intent, I suppose, behind book banning. And as you said, she refers to it as it offers the illusion of parental control. Right. And I think that, well, we'll get into some of the issues. Because, we refer to a lot of things in this attempt to really protect and screen and protect our students and our children. But a lot of times that really is just an illusion. We think that we're providing this protection, but it's probably not as much as we think that it is.
Right. And this Jessica Gross, for those of you who don't know her, she writes a parenting column for the New York Times. She's thoughtful. She discusses a range of issues, everything from a recent one on infant formula, that's in the news. And so in this article, she writes it from her particular perspective. And she talks about, she begins, excuse me, by talking about her own appetite when she was a teenager for reading books that had absolutely no literary, and she does it sort of in a humorous way. Mm-hmm. She talks about her own appetite for reading books had absolutely no literary value and would probably be considered at least inappropriate, possibly pornographic by any community standard that you use, okay? And she talks in particular, there was a book called The Bell Jar, and I don't know whether, I remember The Bell Jar. It was on the bestseller list for a long time. And she said, what she took from The Bell Jar is probably not what her teacher intended for her to take from it.
Right.
And so she makes 3 important points about current demands for banning certain books from school libraries and media centers.
Right.
I'm gonna let you take that.
Oh, yeah. So the first one is that book bans, that they're really political fights, right? They're political fights among adults that really leak into the lives of kids. And it's not really about the kids.
No.
One of the books, for example, I'm going to use an example from what we reviewed, and that was and it was actually my committee that reviewed it, and it was oh my gosh, the name of it just went out of my mind. It was by a Nobel Prize winning author and it was a Pulitzer Prize winner. And it talked about slavery. What was the name of it, Richard? I can't remember the name of it.
Was it Toni Morrison's book?
Yeah, it was Toni Morrison's book.
Beloved?
Beloved. That's right. Man, it was like out of my brain for a minute there.
Right.
And the book was, it was beautifully written. And as you would imagine, it's a difficult read. It's not in heavy circulation. There's not a lot of students that check that book out. And yes, there are some really challenging passages in the book where it talks about different assaults and just talks about, some really challenging and could be disturbing behavior. But students who are interested in reading that, students who are interested in the topic of, what was it like when slaves were freed and when they were trying to make this transition to the next phase of their life, it's a really well written book for looking at some of those issues. Most of the people who would read that book and try to pull something negative out of that book or look at it as a pornographic piece, they're not going to read that book for that purpose. Right. That's right. We're talking about a book with great literary value, but we're looking to take it out. So that's a political fight. That's a political fight about book content and things like that. It doesn't really have anything to do with students, and it really doesn't consider the potential benefits that it has to those who might read that book.
That's right. And so the first point she makes is these are political fights that adults are having. Okay, and this isn't about the kids. The second thing is she quotes another colleague, another newspaper colleague of hers, and she said the vast majority of teenagers in McMinn County already carry the modern world around in their pockets, the cussing and the sex and the violence and all of it. The McMinn County schools banned the book, it's actually called Maus, M-A-U-S, and that's German for mouth, and it's about the Holocaust. So here's a book about the Holocaust that was banned in Tennessee. So, and this author makes the point. She said, those kids carry around in their pocket all the cussing and the sex and the violence in their cell phones. So they're already in possession of all this stuff. Right. And then the third point they make, that she makes, is these efforts to criminalize distribution of what would be considered pornographic material. And she said that if certain elected officials can deem pornography, non-heterosexual romance, critical race theory, social emotional learning, all of these things are being hotly debated right now. And so she talks about one Texas school librarian, who's quitting her job. And she said, I can't take the risk of recommending a book that might be banned, and I'm going to be labeled as a pedophile or distributing pornographic materials. And she said, I can't take that risk. And so librarians could be quitting in droves simply because they feel that they're at risk.
Yeah, that was something I was struck by in our first meeting with that committee, because there was an attorney talking, right? And he was telling us all the state statutes and everything that we had to go by. Right. And in answering a question, he said, well, technically speaking, if any of these things are considered pornographic, and we have it in our libraries, the person in charge of ordering books for the school libraries could be charged with a crime.
That's right. You're criminalizing what was their job.
Right. So again, to think about a Nobel Prize-winning author whose book won the Pulitzer Prize, and it's been made into movies, and there were several of these books were on the list that we reviewed. That having those books in the library could lead to criminal charges for somebody who, why wouldn't those books be in a library? I mean, those are examples of high quality, well-written, literarily books with literary value. Right. And so it's fascinating, the process. And when we really think about what it is that, the ramifications of all of this,
Right.
It's pretty profound.
Right. Yeah. And so so she raises these 3 points, and then she makes the point that calls to ban or burn, whichever you want to use, it's the same thing, are not new. Okay.
Yeah.
Citizens, whenever citizens insist on banning books, I always think about that scene from the 1930s in Berlin, where they had that big bonfire and
Right.
people are throwing books into the bonfire. And I think, wow, that's a chilling scene. That's a chilling thought that you would happily. I think one of the Indiana Jones movies had that included that scene in it, where the book burning scene, where they're throwing these books on the bonfire, and these were members of the Nazi Party and their sympathizers, where they were just throwing books, and who knows what was destroyed in that fire. And so she also includes an interesting article from the American Library Association, and we put this in the show notes. The American Library Association put together a list of the 10 most banned books in each year from 2001 to 2021.
Right.
So in 2001, these are the 10 most banned books.
Right.
2002, these are the most 10 banned books. So banning books is not new. And in fact, Time Magazine, over 40 years ago, published an article about the growing battle of the books. And she says there's this similar dynamic at work today than was at work 40 years ago. And so the point is, banning books is not new. The idea of getting rid of books is certainly not new. Okay. But then she goes into why is there a demand to ban books currently? Okay.
Yeah. And it's, there are, of course, a lot of competing reasons for this, and a lot of reasons, a lot more than just these few reasons that she mentions. But I think that one of the things that is important to think about is that, we have this sudden increase, of course, following the pandemic.
That's right.
Because we've had, if we just want to look at, we've had more time to look at some of these things. We've had more time to think about some of these things. Again, parents are working really hard to protect and control and shield and shelter their kids from some of these things. But so much of it is, for political control or religious fervor, that we're looking at. These books introduce ideas that are against my political views or my religious views. And because they are against those views, we need to protect our youngsters from them in an attempt to shield and protect them from these ideas that may lead them astray.
Right.
And I think that's a common perspective. And even when we, in our committees, people talked about it in those ways, that we can't let high schoolers read about LGBTQ issues, or read a book that talks about transgender individuals in a positive light. That it's something that's normal, that can happen to some people, and it's all in an attempt to shield and protect, but it's with this guise of political and religious control and shielding. Right.
Yeah. And so 40 years ago, there were reasons why people wanted to ban books. 100 years ago, there were reasons why people wanted to ban books. And banning books is not a new idea. It's not something that just popped up in the last 3 or 4 months. When the pandemic hit, we all lost control. And so parents wanted to regain control wherever they could get it. That was understandable. Okay. But when teenagers went back home, the other thing that we forget is that even college students, kids in their 20, 21, 22, when colleges shut down, kids went back home.
Right.
And so now you have essentially adults returning home. And it was only natural that parents would say, okay, I'm the parent again. Well, but you're the parent of a teenager who's already been living on her own for 2 or 3 years. Okay. So when Gross talks about the illusion of parental control, that's what she's talking about. Because when these teenagers, whether they're high school students or college students, went back home, it was only natural for parents to want to regain control of what they were doing. Well, at that point, kids are going to be doing a lot of things that their parents may not want them to do. Okay. And rather than becoming independent, kids were forced back into a dependent relationship with their parents, okay? And so this period of enforced togetherness gave some parents the illusion that they could regain full authority over their children. And that is an illusion, okay?
Well, right. I think that sort of a nuanced leg of that is that, when parents, when everybody was home together, even college students and high school students, everybody was home, parents witnessed more about what their teenagers and young adults are doing, and they're thinking, wow, we really need to rein this in, because maybe it's because 20 years ago it was the video games. Well, we have to really rein in these video games because look at the all these the school shootings and the violence at school. All those kids play these violent video games, so it must be the video games, so we need to ban those, we need to restrict those. And then so this is another iteration of the same issue, that, well, our kids are becoming sympathetic to these issues or these social issues, and so they must be getting it somewhere, and here's one potential place that they're getting it, and it's in books.
Yeah, they were appalled with what their kids were learning and reading. Suddenly they were watching it up close. When kids were at school and in college, parents didn't know. Now they're at home, they're in the living room, they're in their bedrooms, they're at the dining room table, and parents are saying, wow, what's going on here? And so there was an understandable reaction on the part of many parents. But parents and teens are going to clash. It's going to happen. They have since medieval, forever, okay? And what Gross is saying in this article is this: after age 13, parents have far less control over their children than they think they do. Because at that point, and we made this point last week, that children's hearing apparatus begins to tune more to peers than to parents, okay? So there's a biological change that occurs. She also makes the point that teenagers, the last thing teenagers want, and I chuckled when I got to this part, the last thing teenagers want is to be like their parents. Teenagers don't want to have anything to do with adulthood. And she said, if they wanted to be an adult, they'd be doing the laundry, they'd be cleaning bathrooms, they'd be going grocery shopping for meals that they're preparing. Kids want no part of that. They want just the opposite, okay? But teenagers are not trying to become their parents. They want to be different, they want to be independent, and this includes doing and reading stuff their parents don't approve of. That's almost defines what a teenager is doing, okay? And the final point she makes is that Jessica Gross, and we might add, thousands of other teenagers have read all the books that are on these year by year 10 of the most banned books. And so she rightfully asks the question, did reading these books ruin her life in some way? Did it negatively affect her in some way? Did it corrupt her in some way?
Let's not forget that it wasn't that long ago that they were calling for a ban of all the Harry Potter books.
Well, that was one of the books that was on several of those lists, was Harry Potter. And I thought, man, my daughter read the entire Harry Potter series one year, or as it came out, and it has had a positive and lasting effect on her. Not only did it not have a negative effect, it actually had a positive effect on her. It got her reading again. She had lost an interest in reading by the time she was in 4th or 5th grade, and Harry Potter inspired her to start reading again. So, and here we quote what Gross said. And this is from an adult who went through this as a teenager. She said, "I'm so glad I read so many different kinds of books as a teenager, even supposedly bad ones, because it was fun, because I bonded with my friends over those books, because they gave me goofy ideas I could explore in my head and not acting them out in real life, and some ideas that I had to act out in real life to experience the consequences of those choices." So what she's saying here is that these books had a positive effect on her life. Yes, they were things that her parents didn't want her to read, because that's what teenagers do. They do stuff their parents don't want them to think about, to know about, to read about. But she said, there's nothing negative about any of these books. And she started reading these books when she was 10 or 11 years old. She was a precocious student and a good reader. So we have to remember, I mean, from a teenager's perspective, they're going to access this stuff. Right. I mean, we could talk all about what we access as teenage boys. Our parents didn't want us to, but we did anyway. We found a way. Okay, as that famous line in Jurassic Park, nature finds a way.
Right. Well, and we have to remember that books are a collection and presentation of ideas.
Books are ideas, right?
And when we ban a book, we're trying to ban ideas, and whether you like it or not, teenagers are going to have ideas, and they're going to want to explore and understand those ideas. And we can ban books all day long, but as you said earlier in the podcast, they have access to an infinite number of ideas. And many of those ideas you're not going to want them to be exposed to either. It's all in their pocket, on their phone. Right. And so, again, book banning has been around for a long time. There've been some really negative consequences to that, some negative examples of that related to, you mentioned the Nazi Party earlier. Same thing happened in China, right, in the 1960s.
Oh, it was a terribly frightening time. Yeah.
And if we think about what those governments were doing at the time, what their plan was is to restrict their population from experiencing ideas. They didn't want thinking about different things in ways that was different than what they wanted them to think about. Right. North Korea does the same thing right now. Right. They have restrictions to their internet and restrictions to what their population, the people there can have access to. So it's there, and but it is the ideas. We want kids to think. My goodness, we want them to explore their ideas and their thoughts, and that what comes along with that is knowing what the thoughts and ideas are from other people. Right. And you have to read to get that.
That's right. And this whole idea that if you think of books as ideas, because that's essentially what they are, there's somebody else's ideas, do you want to ban that kind of thinking? Do you want to ban ideas? Do you want to ban somebody else's opinions? Because it gets very close to that, what happened in Germany, what happened in China, what's happening in North Korea. Who gets to decide what gets banned? Right. First of all, can you ban it? Because in all those countries, there was a literature that you weren't allowed to possess, but people possessed it anyway. They just did it in secret. Okay. In our country, it was illegal to teach a slave how to read. But people did it anyway. Okay. And so you can't keep these things, you can't keep ideas contained. Well, you can, but under some very harsh, and is that the country that we want? Right. It was also interesting to me that the first book that was ever banned in the United States was Uncle Tom's Cabin. And the reason it was banned is because it took an abolitionist stance. And this was before the war between the states, before the Civil War, the war for Southern independence. This book was banned because it espoused, it encouraged the abolition of slavery. Okay. And so it was banned. That to me was striking. I mean, why in the world would you ban a book that called for the abolition of slavery? Well, in 1860, we understand why. In 1850, we understand why. Okay? Right. So we have to be careful about banning books, because books are ideas. And is that the kind of place where we want to live? Is that what our Constitution stands for? Okay. Right.
And I think as we're kind of pulling all this together, again, we've talked about how book banning isn't new. This is something that's been around for a long time. Right. But also, I think you made the great point of saying, whose standards are we going by? The Supreme Court
to decide.
The Supreme Court has tried to define obscenity and pornography and everything for a very, very long time. Right. And it has not been successful in formulating a concrete definition that we can consistently use for those terms.
That's right.
Right.
This whole thing, the Supreme Court of the United States has struggled with this issue for over 100 years. What should the obscenity laws and the pornography laws, what does it mean to be obscene? What is pornography? There was a time when women had to almost be fully clothed in order to go to a beach in the summertime. Okay. And we can cite all kinds of things that at the time sounded reasonable, that seemed to be reasonable, that changed over time. And so obscenity laws the Supreme Court of the United States has never succeeded in defining what obscenity and pornography are. And we all remember that one Supreme Court justice, and I think it was in the 20s, I think 1927 or something. And he said, well, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. That famous line about, I don't know, but that was a Supreme Court justice who said that. And so we have trouble defining exactly what obscenity and pornography are. And it's in the eyes of the beholder. What may look like pornography for you might not be that for me. Right. And so eventually this is going to become a legal issue. It's, what are the laws, and does this violate the law? Okay. Right. It has nothing to do with the literary value of the book. It's that somebody's going to have to decide, and it's probably going to be some judge to decide that this book somehow violates your state's obscenity laws.
Right. And I think that, we've talked about this point many times on the podcast, but many of the books that people look to have banned contain issues that are maybe controversial or maybe edgy, if we want to think about it that way or something. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's an issue that you need to protect your child from. Usually it means it's an issue that you need to confront your children with and talk to them about it and sit with them and explore those ideas and share with, it's perfectly appropriate to share with them your perspective of it. If you disagree with that view or that lifestyle or those ideas, to talk to them about how you disagree with it is perfectly acceptable. And that's really healthy for them. Mm-hmm. But denying them the knowledge that it exists, believe us when we say they're going to find out that it exists. And if you
find it anyway,
haven't talked to them about it, and if you haven't explored those ideas with them, they're just going to grab onto the ideas that somebody else is offering to them, and they're not going to have any background, and so that's going to become their truth.
Right. Yeah. Younger than age 12. I think what we're talking about is elementary school. In elementary school, parents have a considerable amount of control over what their children access. And we have parental controls. We control the TV. We control their devices. After age 13, that all goes away. Okay, because teenagers are going to find a way. They're going to get access to this stuff. They're not. One writer put it, the brainwashing is over by the time kids get to 13 or 14. You can brainwash your elementary school age children. Once teenagers start to leave the nest, your control is going to be diluted a little more every year. Okay, you're just not going to be able to control this. There's just no way that you're going to keep these books out of their hands. So in those cases, what Gross and others are saying is, given that the kids are going to access them anyway, let's do it together. Let's do these things with our children, not prevent or prohibit our children from having access to them. I would rather read Harry Potter with my kids and discuss it with them, or watch the Hunger Games on TV, or any of these other questionable materials. I would rather discuss that with my children than to try to prevent them from having access to it.
Absolutely, yeah.
And that's my role as a parent.
Yeah, that kind of control is an illusion. And again, all we need to do really is think about those historical examples of countries and places who have worked so diligently to ban books and control what their population had access to, and think about, is that the example that we want to follow here in our country and in our communities? And I think that typically the answer to that is going to be no. We don't want to follow those.
That's right. Yeah. So the 2 points are, number one, you're not going to control what teenagers have access to. not today, not with cell phones
Right.
and the internet. You just an illusion. So that you can't do it. Number two, you shouldn't do it. You should be allowing your children to grow and to expand and to become independent. You should be encouraging their independence, and reading is one of the ways to do that. And third, who do you really want to ban? I mean, think about the countries that have successfully banned books.
Right.
Do you want, is that what you envision the United States to look like? And I think for most people, the answer is no.
Right. And of course, obviously, we're not talking about those things that are, very obviously pornographic, or we're not talking about that kind of stuff. But, we're talking about most literary works. We should have those discussions and talk about those things and everything. So.
Yeah, there was a time when men's magazines were displayed at the checkout counter of the grocery store. They were behind little opaque coverings, but they're not there anymore, and I don't mind that. Okay, I have no problem with that, because those are not literary. Those are meant for a very different purpose. I have no problem at all putting those behind the counter.
Right. Those are provided for very particular purposes, and
that's right.
That's not what we're talking about with.
Not what we're talking about here at all. No, and I don't think anybody disagrees with that.
Right.
We're not calling for that. What we are saying is kids should have access, and they should have access with their parents. If you want parents to be involved, then let parents be involved.
Absolutely. All right. Well, that's it for today. Until next time, stay happy, stay healthy, and forget to be afraid.